Okay, testing the audio for the room. Can everyone hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
All right. Is that Claire?
It is.
Hello, Claire. How are you?
Good, how are you?
I'm wonderful.
I can hear you now.
Wonderful. So we've got on the call Ruth, Sue, Aaron, Kieran, who's also in the room, and Claire. Hello, everyone. We've also got in the physical room. Sue? Oh, Sue, sorry. I thought I said your name, but my colleague informs me I forgot Sue as well. Welcome, Sue, as well. And we've got in the physical room, Kieran as well. Kieran's doing double duty. We've got Alex, we've got Maria, we've got Alex again. Half of the room is currently comprised of Alexes. And we have on the way some other curious philologists that will be dropping in and out today. So 25 minutes late, that's not too bad by PALAIA standards. So what we'll do is we'll jump right in. Now, this is, thank you everyone for taking the time to join us today for this. Just starting in a bit of a frazzle because we had some technical difficulties. So what I'll do is I'll kick us off by just going over what I hope to sort of do with everyone today. Feel free to pop any questions in the chat. I've got Kieran in the room keeping an eye on the chat for me because I tend to get carried away and I forget to check these things. Now, this is the second Phrygian workshop we've done at PALAIA. But really, it's a sort of a recapitulation of the first one. We're going to go over the material that's already been covered in our first workshop, and then we're going to go even deeper and nerdier into Phrygian language. What I would like to do is quickly sort of run through a timetable for the day. I want us to have 2 breaks because it's a long day to just be doing nonstop philology. We need to hydrate, we need to eat, we need to caffeinate. So I'm going to run us through till 11 o'clock. We'll take a half-hour break for coffee. Or if you guys can't wait and want to come back earlier, that's fine, but I'll give us a half-hour break for coffee. Then we'll do another 90 minutes. We'll have an hour break for lunch, and then we'll do a final 90 minutes. So in the first hour, what I want to do, yes, it's just an hour now, unfortunately, because we're starting late. What I want to do is basically quickly go over what we've already done in the last workshop to get everyone up to speed. It's the easiest stuff of all of the material that we're going to cover. And then in the second half, I would like to take us into the second third, I should say. I'd like to take us into old Phrygian material, and that's going to make up probably the rest of the day, until we have lunch at noon for an hour, and then from 1 to 3:30 when we finish. And the old Phrygian material, actually, in terms of the word count, it's not that large, but we'll see why it's going to take us a little longer to get through it. We're really going to get quite nerdy as we delve into that. So that's going to be the timetable for the day. This is very informal. Any questions or comments at any point, just people in the room, just yell at me, that's fine. And people online, pop your questions in the chat. For those of you who have been here before, yep, you are going to be going to be a bit of deja vu for the first hour, but I have snuck in an extra reading that we didn't do the last time we met to read Phrygian for your guys' benefit as well. And it's Phrygian. In my opinion, you could read the same Phrygian text 10 times in a row and it wouldn't get boring. Now, let's begin. So why don't we begin? I'd like to start these proceedings with a little joke. This is a perfect joke for this subject. The refrigerator could talk, all right? Language would it speak? I love this joke. So, but the language of the Phrygians isn't the language of refrigerators.
The next thing would be that I showed up and that wasn't the laptop. This isn't mine.
Josh just appeared with my laptop. All saved me from this terrible dad joke that I'm starting the proceedings with. So the language that is Phrygian isn't the language of, it's not the language of refrigerators, it's the language of the Phrygians, okay? So we're going to talk a little bit about the Phrygian, their society, but this is a philology and linguistics workshop. We're really going to be focusing on their language. And I'd like to start by looking at this image here. So this is an assemblage of relief elements Okay, so it was a relief that was found in fragments from a sandstone inscribed block found at Kirkeneshdagh. And we're going to look at other material from Kirkeneshdagh later today. And I think this is the perfect visual metaphor for the Phrygian language, actually, because what we see here is a fragmentary image, isn't it? Parts of it survive intact. The top left inscription survives partially intact, and you can read the letters there, and we're going to get into that later. There's images, there's sort of a hint of some kind of iconography, but a lot of it we have to fill in. A lot of it we have to infer. So you see the right griffin there, it's partially preserved, but the left griffin, well, we can tell from the feet that it's a mirror image. So we've sort of filled in the left griffin. Same thing with the icon on the top. And this is really what Phrygian is like. We have fragments of it. We have enough to get a really tantalizing glimpse of this language. We have more of it than scholars usually give us credit for, actually. Phrygian is sort of dismissed as one of these barely attested languages we can't really know anything about. And as we'll see, that's definitely not the case. And also, I think, like this image, there's a lot of things there that are quite interesting, are quite intricate, and quite beautiful, actually. You know, I think this is a very aesthetic image. I think this is quite a beautiful image. And I really wish we had the whole thing. And I would love for us to be able to reconstruct the whole thing and find more of it. And this is definitely the case with the Phrygian language itself. Now, before we dive into the document any further, I'd also like to make the comment, why? You know, why do we bother doing this sort of thing? Why do we bother trying to reconstruct and piece together the fragments of an otherwise barely attested language? And that's really what this workshop is about. It's a workshop about Phrygian, but more so, I think it's a workshop about about reconstructing and deciphering partially attested languages. And I would make the argument that a language is a form of cultural artifact. Okay, just like you know, a sculpted piece of stone, a tapestry, you know, even a long pattern of lifeways that we can read over the period of habitation of a site from antiquity. These are all cultural artifacts. These all speak to the cultures and the lived experiences of people in the past. And I see language as an example of this. When we look at how words form, the aesthetics of them, the way that they express ideas and sentiments of ancient people, we can get a similar window, and I would argue perhaps even a greater window into the culture of the past that we're studying. And by reconstructing Phrygian, we can do this. We can get closer to hearing these voices, these Phrygian voices that haven't spoken in their own language for perhaps 1800, 1700, 1600 years. And we can hold in our hands this cultural artifact of Phrygian people. So who were the Phrygians? Well, I've got a little spiel here. I'll just quickly read it off for our benefit. The Phrygians, they're kind of depicted as peripheral to the Greek world, all right? So they're categorized amongst the various Asian peoples that were allied with Troy or absorbed into the Persian Empire alongside Lydians, Lycians, and Carians. But unlike figures like Gyges of Lydia or Artemisia of Caria, who sort of became legendary for their exploits in these historical and mythological events, there's no notable Phrygian leaders that were preserved in these narratives. We don't have a Phrygian equivalent, really, of like a historical person like Gyges. The Phrygia's prominence lies more in the liminal space between myth and history. Its most famous figures are King Midas and his father Gordius, the founder of Gordian. And, you know, as we'll see, there's evidence to suggest that these were historical people, but these are more figures of myth than anything else, really. Indeed, even Gordian itself, the alleged capital of the Phrygian state, is not really known so much as a place in its own right, but rather as the setting of one of the greatest acts of cultural vandalism in ancient history, which is when Alexander the Great severed the Gordian knot. Probably starting to detect I have a bit of a Phrygian bias there. So Phrygians are thus the archetypal losers of antiquity, really, aren't they? They fought on the wrong side in the Trojan War. They were conquered by Gyges of Lydia, who was then conquered by the Persians, who was then conquered by Alexander, and Alexander was conquered by the, well, not Alexander, he wasn't conquered by anyone, but his successor states, the Hellenistic successor states that came after him were conquered by the Romans. And throughout all of that, the Phrygians have sort of been a subaltern people, haven't they? Archetypal losers of antiquity, obscure highland dwellers with Asian customs, whose legacy in Greco-Roman literature amounts to myths of wealthy kings and the stereotype of the cowed barbarian. So in Athenian drama, even the term krux becomes sort of a catch-all term for speakers of barbarian languages from Anatolia, sort of Greek version of the Near East. So even the ethnonym Phrygian just becomes sort of a word for person that doesn't speak Greek to the east of the Greek-speaking world. Now, Phrygia was great, actually. The University of Pennsylvania's near century of excavations at Gordian have unearthed a highly developed 9th century BC urban center, which would have rivaled those of Egypt and Assyria in its sophistication. So in the early Iron Age, ancient Mediterranean, Gordian would have been one of the greatest cities in the known world. The Phrygian mode was a popular scale for ancient Greek musical composition, and the Phrygian cap's popularity as both an item of dress and a cultural symbol is well known. Do we all know what a Phrygian cap is? Yeah. So the most famous example of the Phrygian cap is actually, I would say these days, what Santa Claus wears. But it's essentially a form of headdress that has a sort of a long cultural history and quite a productive form of, it's quite productive as a form of iconography. Just do a Google search, Phrygian cap, and you'll recognize what I'm talking about here. So there are people on Etsy actually selling Phrygian caps now. So there you go. That's wonderful. That's the age we live in. But it's recurred throughout art, for millennia. Very, very significant sort of cultural icon. The Phrygian cap, a sign of liberty, to be. Most notably, Phrygian religious practices influenced their neighbors. Okay, this is probably the most enduring cultural legacy of the Phrygians. So Cybele, a chthonic mother goddess, known in Phrygian simply as Mater Cybeleia, which probably meant mother of the mountain, was worshipped by Greeks and Romans associated with Gaia and Demeter. 205 BCE, the Sibylline oracle endorsed Cybele's integration into Roman religion during the Second Punic War, initiating her worship as Magna Mater, the Great Mother. A cult alongside those of Mithras, Osiris, and Sabazios, which is possibly another Phrygian deity, spread across the Roman Empire, shaping its religious landscape. All right, so the cultural legacy of the Phrygians is long and deep. Now, the Phrygian language, let's get stuck into the actual language itself, which we'll be looking at today. No Phrygian literature survives. This is the case for most ancient Mediterranean peoples. We have Greek literature and Latin literature. And that's pretty much all that we have surviving in the manuscript tradition. We get some other literature that we find through archaeology, but for the most part, languages of ancient Mediterranean peoples are preserved in indirect testimonia. That's when Greek and Latin authors write about them, or documentary evidence, direct testimonia, inscriptions and graffiti. And this is the case with Phrygian too. So these are the two types of evidence we'll be looking at today. Now, for centuries, only the former category, the indirect testimonia, so the commentaries of Greek and Latin authors on Phrygian, that was all that we had, until in 1800, a discovery at Yazilikaya in Turkey revealed the word Midai in an archaic Greek script. So this is a clear link to King Midas. Now, we're going to actually read this inscription later today itself. But anyone with a cursory understanding of Greek could look at that form Midai and see that it's clearly a dative of the name Midas. So did the first philologists who found it. So this language was actually identified as Phrygian due to the mythological connection between Midas and the Phrygian peoples early on. So in Mortman in 1862 suggested that Phrygian and Armenian were related. This prompted further analysis, and then in the 19th century, scholars like Ramsay and Fick made significant progress through basically through expanding the Phrygian corpus to include two subcorpuses: Old Phrygian, dating from the 9th to the 4th centuries BC, and New Phrygian, largely dating from the 1st to the 2nd centuries CE. So you'll notice then that we have Phrygian preserved over quite a long period of time, don't we? This is quite remarkable. This is quite a unique cultural artifact in and of itself. The fact that we can look at this language as it was spoken, as it was written down over such a long period of time, the we're going to read some of the latest, the youngest Phrygian inscriptions, which probably come from the 3rd century CE. We're going to read today also the oldest, or tied for oldest, found Phrygian inscription, which could come from 800 BC, if not before. More than a millennium of attestation. So by the 20th century, Haas's study broke new ground in reconstructing Phrygian, though he often relied on speculative and unverifiable Persian or Aramaic influences. The most pivotal advance came with Claude Bric's and Lejeune's corpus of Paleo-Phrygian inscriptions. So this updated Haas's work to include essentially where we're at with Proto-Indo-European studies, really bringing it into the modern realm of comparative philology. And what this study found was that Morton was correct in linking Armenian and Phrygian together, only insofar as they were both Indo-European. Then Phrygian and Armenian weren't sister languages. Actually, it turned out Phrygian was a sister language with another language. So a highly influential paper by a fellow called Cortlandt in 1988 demonstrated on the basis of sound changes, which we're going to look at, that Thraco-Armenian, so the ancestors of Thracian and Armenian speakers, broke away from Phrygian at a very early date. And it turned out that the closest language in terms of genetic relationship to Phrygian was Greek, long thought to be the only existing Hellenic language within the family of Indo-European languages. It had found a big sister, Phrygian. So what we're looking at today is actually a sister language of Greek. Now, so you have here on this page, essentially now it's sort of can I flip this for the benefit of people? Yes, I can. Oh, wonderful. Look at that. All right, so this is essentially the family tree that this scholar Cortlandt came up with, right? Now, quick question for the room. Do we all know what Proto-Indo-European is? This is something that's going to come up again and again and again today. Now, there's...
Do you mean Proto-Indo-Anatolian?
I'm not going to talk about Proto-Indo-Anatolian, no. Actually, that will come up with one, I have a footnote about that. No, what about people online? Quick question to the online cohort. Does everyone know what I'm talking about when I say Proto-Indo-European? Let's have a look at the chat. Yes, very good. Okay, so if you look at this, what we have in the central column is the ancestor language, Proto-Indo-European itself. We have these stages of the language as the nucleus population of Indo-European speakers underwent the natural process of diachronic language change. Languages just evolve over time. What happens is subpopulations of people move away from this nucleus. They get separated from the nucleus and their language begins to evolve on its own. So we can see, based on how many innovations are in a sub-branch of Indo-European, how late in the process they broke off. So for example, the Anatolian languages, which I love to study, are all the way over here on the far right because they broke off so early, they're not really related to anything else. We also have what was described by Cortlandt as the classical and central Proto-Indo-European phases, which led to things like Latin and Celtic through the Proto-Italo-Celtic clade, and the Germanic languages, which I'm speaking to you right now in via English, through the Proto-Germanic clade. Now, as you'll see, Greek broke off kind of in the middle of this process. According to Cortlandt, you can see it written in pink there, the population that broke off from the Proto-Indo-European speaking nucleus community was a Proto-Greco-Phrygian community. So what that means is when the original population of Proto-Indo-European speakers, when a subsection of them moved away, that subsection that would eventually lead, whose language would eventually evolve into Greek, well, they were also the ancestors of the Phrygians. So you can see here that Greek and Phrygian are next to each other. They're adjacent clades in the European family tree. All right. Now, so what that means is, as we're going to look at Phrygian today, we're going to keep seeing similarities with Greek. And actually, for various reasons, Greek is going to be kind of the main lens through which we look at a lot of Phrygian until we get to the old Phrygian stages where we can start to try and work with Phrygian on its own terms. Now, what I hope to do today is to first of all look at the indirect testimonia. I'm going to quickly read through some anecdotes by ancient Greek commentators about the Phrygians to kind of get some information about Phrygian and sort of hear what the Greeks had to say about them. We're going to read New Phrygian, which is in a context, as we'll see, where it's in a bilingual Greek Phrygian speaking environment. We're going to mine these corpora for as much information as we can about Phrygian, and then we're going to apply that to the most difficult corpus, the Old Phrygian, and we're going to finish off this process by reading what is actually a section of the largest surviving Phrygian document ever found, which is an Old Phrygian document called the Vezirhan Stele, where we can more or less, there are some exceptions, but we can more or less translate 4 uninterrupted lines of Phrygian text, which is quite a remarkable achievement. So throughout the course of today, we're going to look at all this material, we're going to learn more about Phrygian, we're going to sort of build up our Phrygian muscles as philologists, and at the end of the day, we're going to tackle this extensive document, the Vezirhan Stele, and try and work with it. Now, so first of all, let's look at this quote from Herodotus. Now, this is one of the most famous anecdotes about the Phrygians that survives from classical literature. And it's charming and it's wonderful, and it's going to probably introduce us to the word of the day. What I'd like to do, so my vocal cords don't get totally dried out, is get someone else in the room to read these 2 anecdotes. We might share them. Someone can do the first one. There's 2 anecdotes from Herodotus. We're going to do the second one. Are there any volunteers? You don't have to read the Greek. I've provided them in translation. Are there any volunteers for reading first anecdote?
You're reading them in English.
Yeah. You don't have to read them in Greek. I'm literally just, this isn't to practice, Maria, for you to practice your Greek. This is literally just so my vocal cords don't get one out of the day. Yeah, all right. So just that first quote there.
As the Macedonians say, these Phrygians were called Phrygians as long as they dwelt in Europe, they were native Macedonians. When they changed their home to Asia, they changed their name also and were called Phrygians.
So what we seem to have here, Herodotus speaking to this process that we see on this map. The theory is that the Phrygians were originally lived in Thrace. They migrated across the Bosporus into Phrygia, where they settled. Herodotus also makes that interesting comment that when they lived in Thrace, they were called Briges. And then after they moved to Anatolia, they changed their name to Phryges. So we have that PH sound at the start of their name, replacing a B sound. I want you to remember that because this alternation between a B and a PH sound, or a voiced bilabial stop, B, and a aspirated, unvoiced bilabial stop, P, this alternation is something that's going to keep coming up. So even though he might know what he's talking about there, Herodotus seems to be speaking to an actual phonetic relationship we're going to explore. Now, as we can see, it turns out that quite likely it wasn't just the Phrygians who did that, but also the ancestors of the Greeks. This is what we call the Balkanic, Proto-Balkanic population of language speakers, then moved both into Greece and then across the Bosporus into Anatolia. All right, so Herodotus gets a sort of a bad reputation as a source, but actually seems to be speaking there to something that philology has verified, seems to have actually happened, the migration from Thrace into Anatolia by Phrygians. What about this second anecdote? This is quite bizarre and it's a bit long. Anyone want to have a go at reading this story about this Egyptian pharaoh who stumbled across a Phrygian word?
Sure, I'll read.
All right, so Alex, okay, you'll be Alex 1 and you'll be Alex A. And A. So Alex 1, can you read the yes. It's in English, not in Greek.
Ticus, when he was in no way able to learn by inquiry, people had first come into being, devised a plan by which he took 2 newborn children of the common people and gave them to a shepherd to bring up among his flocks. He gave instructions that no one was to speak a word in their hearing. They were to stay by themselves in a lonely hut, In due time, the shepherd was to bring goats and give the children their milk and do everything else necessary. Psammetichus did this, and gave these instructions because he wanted to hear what speech would first come from the children. When they were past the age of indistinct babbling, and he had his wish, one day, when the shepherd had done as he was told for 2 years, both children ran to him, stretching out their hands and calling Bekos, as opened the door and entered. When he first heard this, he kept quiet about it. When, coming often and paying careful attention, he kept hearing the same word, he told his master at last and brought the children into the king's presence as required. Psammetichus then heard them himself and asked what language the word Bekos belonged. He found it to be a Phrygian word signifying bread.
Great, thank you. So that's a very interesting approach to diachronic language change. The idea that it's sort of this idea that Psammetichos, this Egyptian pharaoh, had, that there's a primordial language which we all instinctively speak. We will instinctively learn the phenomenon of language, and that this must therefore logically be the first language. So the logical inference is, if you take children and you isolate them from people who speak any language, you will then be able to reveal what this first primordial language was. Actually, in the medieval period, there were various European monarchs that conducted similar experiments. Yes, pre-Babel, exactly, which seemed to lead them to the conclusion that Hebrew was the oldest language. But in this case, Phrygian got the crown. Now, notice here that in this, and this is a very famous anecdote about Phrygian, and you'll hear this repeated quite a lot. But the sort of central to this discovery was that the children were asking for food, and they were saying the word Bekos. And so we have here preserved in this story by Herodotus a Phrygian word. This is our first fragment of Phrygian through the indirect testimonial that we've encountered. We have one Phrygian word, Bekos, which allegedly means bread. All right. So let's keep on reading. Does anyone want to read this quote from the Cratylus? We're not going to go through all of these indirect testimony, but this next one is worth reading and sharing with the group. So the Cratylus is a discourse, a Platonic discourse, exploring whether words have a natural connection to the things they signify or are arbitrary and based on convention. So actually, it's an early attempt at cognitive semantics, really. It's sort of exploring this question of linguistics that was not really comprehensively returned to until the 19th century, and then very much so the 20th century with people like Chomsky and his successors. So it's a wonderful discourse, and we have just this brief quote from it where Socrates is making some observations about language, and he's using Phrygian as an example. Anyone want to quickly read this for the group?
I'll read some Socrates.
Yes, very good.
You see then that this noun fire, pur, is certainly a barbarian form, for it is difficult to connect it with the Greek language. And it's also clear that the Phrygians have the same word, only slightly altered. The same is the case with water, pudor, dogs, punas, and many other words.
Wonderful, thank you. So you see, to the Greeks, there was this, and this is a question about, they're exploring the idea that languages can have loan words. And what he's saying is that he's thinking, Socrates, that actually the Greek word for fire, dog, and water isn't Greek. It's actually a loan word from what he's classifying as a barbarian Phrygian. But the main thing to take away from this is this understanding that we have by Greek speakers in the classical period already, that Phrygian sounds like Greek. There's a connection between Phrygian and Greek. They might not be jumping to the conclusion that they're related languages genetically, but they're observing in their environment that, hey, this language of the Phrygians sounds like our language. Now, what we're going to do is just, I'm going to quickly show you the other indirect testimonia for your benefit. This is a quote, this is an excerpt of a poem. And I encourage you to read it in translation at your own time, in which we have what appears to be a Phrygian, a captive at the Battle of Salamis, begging for his life. And the poet, Timotheus, actually adopts a kind of barbarian or foreigner, a secondary foreigner talk. The Phrygian is speaking in imperfect Greek, very imperfect Greek, butchered Greek, and it's sort of an imitation of what Phrygian speakers, assuming that this is a Phrygian character, would have sounded like to the Greeks. I encourage you to read that in your own time. And we also have this wonderful quote here about a story of how a certain area, a certain city, came to have a funny name, which translated allegedly as hedgehog fox. It's a cute little story, and it actually gives us the potential origin, the potential identification of what the Greek word for hedgehog and the Greek word for fox was. So I encourage you to look at that in your own time. They're very charming. What I would like to get stuck into quickly, before we move on to reading some Phrygian, is this document here. Number 3, Hesychius of Alexandria. Now, has anyone heard of Hesychius before? I think most people in the room probably have. Have you heard of Hesychius before? Yep, great. And what about people online? Are we familiar with this character, Hesychius? So Hesychius of Alexandria was a, let's see, so Hesychius of Alexandria was a Greek grammarian of the 5th century CE. And he wrote a lexicon called the Synagoge Passon Lexeon Katastoikeon. So it's sort of the gathering together, the collection of all words according to the alphabet, according to the letter that the first letter that they start with. So this is what we would think of as a lexicon. It remains the most comprehensive collection of unusual and obscure Greek words that have survived. So there's many words in Hesychius's lexicon from 1500 years ago that don't survive in any other Greek document. He says, this is a word that means this is a word that means that. So clearly in his time, they'd already become obscure and many people weren't aware of their meaning. Now, Hesychius's lexicon only survives through a highly corrupted 15th century manuscript housed in Venice. But it's a priceless resource for Greek philology. There's so many things we can learn from Hesychius. We can learn about things like language change, how the Greek language naturally started to change and innovate new words, which is what I generally study actually on a day-to-day basis. This is my field. We always find ourselves looking at Hesychius to see if a word was referenced by him there. He often has charming comments like, this is a vulgar or corrupted form. Don't use that form, use this proper pure form. Now, one thing that Hesychius would write about various the words in his massive dictionary is, this is a Phrygian word. So he collected together, just through the process of collecting so many Greek words together into his lexicon, quite a few words that are actually possibly Phrygian in origin, and therefore they're a resource for us to actually expand the potential Phrygian vocabulary that we have to work with. And what's more, these are just charming. Many of these words are quite strange, quite endearing. So what I'd like to do is very quickly read through the Greek actually, and I'll translate as we go. And let's have a look at a selection here of words from Hesychius that he alleges are Phrygian in origin. So what I'll do is maybe I'll get Alex A. Do you feel up to reading some Greek? Yep. Why don't you read us through your turn? Why don't you read us through the Greek, and I'll read out the translations for the benefit of people living. So we have our first entry under alpha there.
Adamne, what philein, kai phryges ton philon adamna legusin.
So adamnen, to love. Also, the Phrygians call a friend an adamna. So it seems like this is a colloquialism in Phrygia, their version of maybe xenos or something like that, or los. Is adamna, and then we have derived from that this Greek verb, obscure verb of loving. Do we potentially have a Phrygian verb for loving here? Who knows? What else have we got?
Stena, orgona, phryges.
And asdena. So essentially this seems to be an obscure word for beard. And Hesychius leaves this brief comment, yes, that's what the Phrygians call the beard. Some attempts have been made to link this to a Proto-Indo-European word for beard, but it hasn't quite been. And the actual etymology would translate literally something as the upon a chin, but it hasn't been verified yet. So we're not sure that this is actually from a Proto-Indo-European word for beard. But anyway, it's a wonderful word. Next one.
Akristin, ektrian, aletrida, phryges.
Yeah. So an akristin, a bakeress, or a female slave who grinds grain. Again, apparently this is a Phrygian word or something Phrygians use. I think it's actually not clear here if this is perhaps, there were many Phrygian slaves in the Greek-speaking world too. So I'm not sure if this is a reference to a Phrygian word or perhaps a particular Phrygian slave or both. Anyway, it's an interesting entry.
PALAIA, basileus, phrygisti.
Balein. All right, so allegedly this is the word for king in Phrygian. We actually, as you'll see, we're going to be able to sort of test this out as we read some actual Old Phrygian later today. Balein, interesting. If that reminds you of a Semitic word with a similar meaning, you might be onto something. All right, let's continue.
Bambalon, imathion, kai to idoion, phryges.
All right, I love this word, a bambalon. Isn't that a wonderful sounding word? Yeah, apparently, yeah, thank you, Alex. It's a himation, which is a cloak, but kai to idoion, it's also the pudenda. Again, we have this appellation, Phrygians. So it's a word, you don't want to use this word in the wrong context, do you? It can mean cloak, it can also mean genitalia. And I'm not sure, are both of them a Phrygian word? Is one or the other? Hesychius isn't clear. Anyway. Next one.
Dekos, artos, phryges.
All right, so we have our first example of the different testimonia aligning, all right? Hesychius here preserves this word that we saw in that story from Herodotus. Bekos, bread. All right.
Would you have had that independently or would you have been taking?
It would have just looked.
Now, this is the question. So Maria's asked a very good question. Is Hesychius just thinking of this story from Herodotus? Or is Hesychius going around hearing Phrygian spoken? In Hesychius's time, it's very likely that Phrygian had died out, though only fairly recently. Hesychius also is based in Alexandria. He's not hearing any Phrygian spoken on a day-to-day basis. So all of Hesychius's data is coming from other information, other stories about Phrygians, stories about Greek accounts of the Greek language, works by other grammarians that are lost, things like that. There were various works, collections of Phrygian folk tales, discourses on the Phrygian language. I even stumbled across apparently a Phrygian account of the Trojan story that was then translated into medieval Latin from an old Greek source. So this is a sort of a literary environment that Hesychius is writing in, and this is what's informing his glosses. Another thing to remember is we only have one manuscript from the 15th century of Hesychius. It's very corrupt as well. So it's possible, in the case of Bekos, that's clearly the original word he meant to write down in his original manuscript. But some of these words that are entered here may have been misspelt in the manuscript tradition as well. All right, next up. Right. It's a big one.
Phryges, oimen phryges, oida barbaroi, oida soloi kistai, iogaste hypoludon, apophynatai briga legestai ton eleutheron.
Yeah, so the Phryges. So oimen Phryges, either the Phrygians, oide barbaroi, or barbarians, or, according to some, oide soloi kistai, those who speak ungrammatically. Juba, this is, by the way, that Juba, the famous Juba, the great enemy of Rome, ally then enemy of Rome, who a lot of people forget that he was a great scholar of his time and published quite a few works, none of which survive. But quoting Juba here, Hesychius says that Juba observes that the Lydians called the Phryges, the free ones, ton eleutheron. So this is this word that Herodotus had said was the original name for Phrygians before they moved to Anatolia. Remember, he alleged that they originally called themselves Phryges, and that's what the Macedonians called them, the Phryges, Macedonians who lived in Thrace. And then when they moved to Anatolia, they changed their name to Phrygians. And here we see Hesychius preserving this word Phryges as either a word for Phrygian or a word for barbaroi, or barbaros, or a word for someone who speaks in a corrupted language. And I think these various different usages of the word speak to kind of the position of Phrygians sort of on the borders of these different populations, Persian Empire and the Greek-speaking world. It seems that even an ethnonym that perhaps originally denoted them as a people has come to be used just as a word for foreigner by, for example, Lydians, foreigner or free ones, people who aren't part of the state. Very interesting gloss in terms of political science, but less so for language. Let's move on to the next one.
Phrygisbata, orchesis phrygiace,
I love this one. Abrikismata, a Phrygian dance. It even sounds like a dance, doesn't it? Abrikismata. All right, next.
Ganos, Paradisos, Carpa, Phos, Auger, Leucotes, Lampedon, Hedone, Kai he Huaina, Hypofrigon, Kai Hudunon.
All right, so Ganos. Now there's so many sources, there's so many glosses here. It's a garden, it's a source of joy, it's light, it's sunlight, it's whiteness, it's luster, it's enjoyment. And then also for Phrygians and Bithynians is the word for a hyena. Very interesting. Now, I'd like you to keep in mind that what we often have with these manuscripts is a confusion between gamma and digamma. It's quite possible originally that word ganos in the original Hesychian manuscript was written wanos. In your own time, you can read some of the other indirect testimony there because that word wanos does come up in another Greek source. And so it's possible that this Hesychian gloss for hyena might actually be true. Only it wasn't ganos, that's a textual corruption, but the Phrygian word for hyena was wanos. All right, let's quickly move through the remaining ones.
Galaros, Adelphu Gune, Phrygisti.
All right, so the Gelaros, the wife of a brother in Phrygian. Interesting.
Lurea, Crusea, Phryges, Chrysos.
Glurea, right? So the Phrygian word for golden things, which in Greek is krusea. And if you observe a sort of a formal similarity between the sound of these two words, remember that, because that is a suggestion that these are indeed related words, and therefore this might actually be a Phrygian word.
Daos, Phos, Dada, Kur, Phlox, Phengos, Auger, Kai Hypofrugon, Lukos.
So again, so many different glosses. It's a daos is light, torch, fire, flame, moonlight, sunlight, but also for the Phrygians, a wolf. So we have another potential animal word here.
Zelkia, Lachana, Phryges.
Right? Potentially we have the Phrygian word for veggies, zelgia.
Zemelen, Barbaron and Rapadon, Phryges.
Barbarian slave, according to the Phrygians, a zemmelen. All right.
Zeuman, Ken Pegen, Phryges.
Zeuman, the Phrygian word for spring.
Iklen, Ken Arcton, to Astron, Phryges.
So a Kiklen is apparently what Phrygians call the bear star, the constellation Ursa Major. So that's interesting. I won't go into details, but it's also possible that this is actually the Phrygian word for chariot. In quite a few languages, an alternative word for that constellation is chariot, including Old English. The Old English word for this constellation, they often called it, can't remember the word, but it essentially meant wagon. Kiklen, if that makes you think of a kuklos, a wheel, see how that could potentially be a word for chariot. That might be right, these last few.
Chimeros, Nous, Phryges.
All right, so chimeros, the Phrygian word for the mind, allegedly.
Robata, Phryges.
All right, now this is my favorite one here, actually, because, well, I mean, I think you can see why a word for sheep in any language could be rendered as ma, can't you? So I think Hesychius might be onto something there, that yes, that when the Phrygians saw a sheep, they might be inclined to go ma. All right, what else have we got?
Xenones, hoi andrones, hypofrugon.
All right, so the xenones in Phrygian, it's the men's quarters of the house. So it's interesting. It's a bit of a window into how Phrygian houses are designed. Sounds quite similar to the front room used for the symposion in classical Athens. Also notice the xenones, similarity to Greek xenos, another hint that maybe this is a related word. All right, the last one.
Sukhoi, hypodemata phrygia.
All right, so now we have a Phrygian word for sandals. Now we're going to end our indirect testimonial there. There's more that you can go into in your own time, and I encourage it. But just before we move on to looking at some actual Phrygian, you'll see that here's just an example of the document we were just reading. This is a page from the manuscript that has preserved Hesychius's wonderful lexicon. This goes for thousands of pages in this sort of cramped, but I think quite aesthetic early Byzantine Greek hand. This is the entry for pi. You can see there on the left, pi, showing you that every letter, every word after that starts with pi. By the way, this is quite an innovation of Hesychius's. Before this, it wasn't taken for granted that lexica were arranged according to the first letter of each word. Hesychius isn't necessarily the origin of that, but he is a wonderful early example of this developing tradition.
You've also got a question from Aaron. Does Hesychius also reference etymology of other languages?
He does. I've other fragmentary languages that I've put my toe into, such as Carian, which is an Anatolian language. There's a few Carian glosses in Hesychius. A lot of things like Thracian words, the Greeks always seem to be assuming that a word had a Thracian origin, probably for a similar reason why they would assume it had a Phrygian origin. If you go north from Greece, you encounter the Thracians. If you go east from Greece, you're probably going to encounter Phrygians. So they're the first non-Greek speaking people you encounter. Between you and I've looked into it, and I can give you some references for a methodical treatment on Hesychius's glosses. I think about half of his are correct. About half of his probably do actually speak to Phrygian words. The other half are probably just obscure or words of another that originate with another language, not Phrygian. And the reason why we can tell that is, well, by the end of the day, you'll know why we sort of can make these statements. There's enough that we've learned about Phrygian now that we can look at a word that is allegedly Phrygian. We can think about what root it comes from. We can look at how that word is being pronounced, and we can say, that doesn't seem Phrygian. The idea is that by the end of today, we'll all sort of be trained in how to do this to a superficial extent. So this is the end of our indirect testimonia. What I've collected there in that first part of the document represents most of our secondary source material about the Phrygian language. As I said, there are accounts of whole treatises on the Phrygian language written in Greek that haven't survived, unfortunately. This is what we have to go with. Now, because the actual corpus of Phrygian that survives itself is so fragmentary, you might then say, is it possible at all that we can decipher it? I mean, how would you go about deciphering a language when you don't have that survives anything like a grammar or a large enough corpus that you can just mine it for data? For example, if we didn't know anything about Greek, but we could figure out the basics of how the letters were pronounced through comparison with other alphabets, and we found all of the Greek manuscripts that have actually survived throughout the manuscript tradition, we could use brute force philology to crack Greek and figure it out. But when you have a smaller collection, like with Phrygian, how do you go about deciphering it? Well, it's the same as many of the other quite famous languages that have been deciphered. There's three main ways, there's three main types of evidence that we need. All right, three main types of direct testimonia or deciphering ancient languages. Now, the first one, which you're all probably thinking of, is a Rosetta Stone. All right, so the Rosetta Stone, quite famously, trilingual actually, not a bilingual. I personally think that the Greek Lycian trilingual Xanthus obelisk is more important and famous than the Rosetta Stone myself, because this is a document written in Greek, Aramaic, and Lycian that allows us to have deciphered the Lycian language, which I love working with. But the Rosetta Stone is the most famous example, and essentially what it is, gives you a concordance of a text in multiple languages where the syntax is quite similar, all right? So what you can do is you can take the language that you know, and you can then map that onto the language that you don't know to try and decipher it. This is famously how we deciphered both hieroglyphic Egyptian and Demotic Egyptian. Don't have any Rosetta Stones for Phrygian. There's nothing like a large, close bilingual Phrygian Greek or Phrygian Aramaic text that has survived, unfortunately. Now, the second type of corpus is cross-linguistic documents. Now, these are texts in which they're not bilinguals, they're not translations of each other, but they exist in a corpus that is multilingual. They all share formulaic features. Now, a classic example of this are the Arzawa letters. So these are the letters written from the Egyptian pharaoh to various other kings in late Bronze Age Mediterranean world that he was in diplomatically. And actually, even though it's from the Egyptian king, the majority of these letters are written in the languages of the peoples whom the king was in correspondence with. For example, at this time, Egypt was very closely engaged with the Hittite Empire politically. And we have a collection of Hittite letters in this corpus. Now, at the time when they were first excavated, we didn't know anything about Hittite. This was before Grozny and that Norwegian philologist, whose name I can't remember, first essentially started cracking the code of Hittite. But a lot of information in the Arzawa letters that tell us things about Hittite, because, for example, every letter, regardless of the language it is, will have the same formulaic opening phrase. Protocol also have the same formulaic closing phrase, shatakol, in which the kings address each other with certain honorific titles. So you can just use a surface analysis of the document to see where these formulaic phrases that exist in one language that you do understand probably are rendered in an equivalent other language which you don't understand. Now, the third type of document that we can use for deciphering ancient languages are documents in context. Now, these are essentially documents that we find in their original context, where they were composed, that speak to something in the extra-linguistic environment. A big problem that we have with quite a few ancient languages that survive is that patterns can be discerned in the material that they contain that can be inferred to speak to meaning. But the only way that you can verify that that is an actual translation and isn't just an interpretation is if you can find some supportive evidence. Now, obviously, something like a bilingual or a document written in another language is an excellent, that shares the same features, is an excellent form of verifying evidence. But it doesn't always have to be the case. For example, sometimes, imagine, say, in the ruins of Sydney, thousands of years from now, you were to find a street sign saying George Street. And you would happen to know, archaeologically, that it has been found in the location where George Street existed, in the ruins of Sydney. You can read the Latin script, and you have, through other sources, records of this word, George Street. You know that there is a street called George Street that was there. Therefore, in 21st century Australian English, you could reliably posit that you have found the word in Australian English for George Street, or perhaps for street, because you can relate that to the extra-linguistic world. A good example of this is actually the Linear B tablets. So, for example, you can see here on the Linear B tablets a siglum. This is an ideogram. And if it looks to you like a tripod, that's because it is a tripod. And this is one of the features that the philologists that worked on Linear B, most famously Ventris and Chadwick, but there were many other philologists before them who did critical work. Sorry. Alice, yes, Kobo, my wonderful Hungarian-American philologist who doesn't get as much credit as she deserves. And there were others too. But this is one of the elements of the Linear B tablets that were taken to essentially give us proof that what we are dealing with here is a form of Greek, because here you have a siglum, an ideogram, denoting a tripod. You can tell extra-linguistically that this is an image of a tripod. And we also know from the excavations at Knossos that they found lots of tripods. So you could posit that this is a list of tripods. And sure enough, with the hypothetical sound values that had been assigned to Linear B, we have the sequence here, T, Ri, Por, De, a dual form of tripod, two tripods. And here we have a tripod. Here we have two dashes, indicating two of them. All right. This is an example of information in the extra-linguistic universe that we can use to verify our interpretations of an ancient text. Does that make sense to everyone? This idea of extra-linguistic data that's so essential. Now, this is what's lacking in so many of these interpretations that you'll hear about, for example, for the Indus Valley script, or for Linear A. You see, it's something that makes the headlines every 6 months that, oh, you know, there's this new supposed interpretation of these texts. And usually it's rooted in the idea that someone has found the language family that they belong to. Oh, it turns out they're Celtic speakers or Hungarian speakers or something like that. Now, the fact is that generally what this comes down to is patterns that have been discerned in the signs that are read in the ancient document. All right, those patterns are then mapped onto a theory. But that theory is just a theory. It's not grounded in any extra-linguistic information, all right? For that, you need context for the documents that you're reading, and you need to be able to read the sound values so that you can assign theoretical words, theoretical acoustic interpretations to the extra-linguistic data that you found. So these are the three types of evidence that we have. Now, we don't have true bilingual for Phrygian. We do have the other two types. formulaic cross-linguistic documents, and documents in context. And as we move on to New Phrygian, and I can't believe I've only got 10 minutes left with which to do it, it's going to bleed into the next part of the talk, I think. You'll see that for the quite predominantly, New Phrygian falls into this category document. For the most part, Old Phrygian falls into this category of document. All right, so let's move on. And let's actually finally read some Phrygian itself. Now we're going to get through maybe 2 of these before we break. Then we'll do a couple more after the break, and then we'll dive into Old Phrygian. So moving into direct testimonia to Phrygian, bilingual inscriptions in Koine Greek and New Phrygian. So if you remember before, I showed you this little chart, scrolling up quickly, of the corpus of Phrygian and how it's divided into New and Old Phrygian. Here it is up here, okay? And so as you can see, we have about 120 inscriptions in New Phrygian that survive, which make up a quarter of the corpus, the overall Phrygian corpora. However, these are extremely valuable. They really pull their weight more than the numbers that they represent in helping us decipher Phrygian, because they're in a enmeshed linguistic environment with Greek, which is a language that we definitely do understand. So below we'll see some examples of the many bilingual inscriptions in Greek and Phrygian that have been found in Anatolia. As many of the non-Greek languages of Anatolia became moribund in the Hellenistic period, so for example, Lydian, Lycian, all these languages died out in the Hellenistic period. It's quite remarkable to find evidence of a new Phrygian dialect still being spoken in rural communities in the Roman period. These inscriptions are highly formulaic, predominantly containing imprecative clauses. Does everyone know what an imprecative clause is? An imprecation? It's essentially a direct command to someone saying, do not do this unless or else. So an imprecation it contains 2 subclauses, the thing that you're not supposed to do and the or else, what will happen if you do it. That's an imprecation. And the majority of these Phrygian, New Phrygian inscriptions are these imprecations. They're imprecative clauses against potential violators to the funerary monuments on which they were inscribed. So in these small Phrygian-speaking communities that survive in rural Phrygia into the Roman period, they're writing these Phrygian curses and warning signs on their tombs, and that's what survived for us to read. The study of these texts can be fruitful for the decipherment of Old Phrygian due to their enmeshed context amongst equivalent Greek inscriptions with similar funerary formula. Let's read this first one here before we break. So this is New Phrygian number 25.2. It's a complete inscription on a broken stela from Shuhud. This is the ancient town of Sinada, and now it's in the Afyon Museum in Turkey. So you can see there on the left, the original, and on the right, a line drawing of the inscription. And as you can see, we have Greek letter forms. So this is another feature of New Phrygian. It's written using the Greek alphabet. This is bilingual. First half is in Greek. And then when we get to this symbol here, this is what's known as a hedera. And if you think that looks like an ivy leaf, you're correct. Hedera is actually just the Latin word for ivy. And this is used often in these inscriptions to mark where the Phrygian begins and the Greek ends, or vice versa. Beginning here, we have the Phrygian text. Now, of course, it's in transcription for our benefit. This won't be the case when we get to Old Phrygian, by the way. So let's quickly read it. Now, I might get Levi. We have in the room some quite experienced Greekists. 3, 4, actually, you count. Yeah, you do. Yeah, Marian's definitely an experienced Greekist at this point. So I think Marian's trust in the room, and we have an aspiring Greekist as well. We can handle some of the Greek translations. For those at home, I recommend you write down the Greek translation just next to the document, or like on a note document. For those in the room, just scribble it down next to the Greek. And the English translations of the Greek, you'll see that it gives us context to help us understand what's going on with the Phrygian. Now, Levi, can you read the Greek, and why don't you help us translate? Well, how about I read the Greek? Why don't you read the Greek? Would you like to read the Greek?
I'll read the Greek.
Very good. Wonderful. You have wonderful Greek dictions.
Propimus Caesaros doulos kai Valeria Claudia prepuse Sunganidi, Euergetidi.
It's a tough one.
Yeah.
Euergetidi. Yeah. Well done, well done.
Yeah.
So how about we translate? So we have Tropimos Kaisaros Doulos.
The servant of Caesar.
Yes, Tropimos, Mr. Tropimos, a servant of Caesar. So this is his status in the community. He's some kind of member of, definitely very low-ranking member of the imperial bureaucracy. So he described himself here as a servant of Caesar, probably some local assistant to some local procurator or something like this. Kai, and everyone. So Kai is the Greek word for and, everyone. Valeria Glukea. Another name, Valeria Glycia, Valeria the sweetie one, literally what her name means, Valeria sweetie. Claudia, these are datives now, Claudia Prepuse, or Claudia Prepuse. So this is either a last name, Prepusa, or this is just a part of the inscription saying, because she's very well esteemed. Because prepuse literally means to be famous, to be held in high regard, to be seen clearly. It's not sure which one, what it is, but let's just say it's her last name, Claudia Prepusa. Sungenidi. What's your sungenes?
Relative.
Relative, yes. Yes. Kinsperson, exactly. This is actually a feminine form, so a kinswoman. This is a sungenida. Sorry, a sungen. Sungenida, yes, because it's an adjective that declines. And she's also a Euergetidi.
Benefactress.
Benefactress, an explicitly feminine form of this word, yep. So that's very formulaic, right? Mr. Tropimos, the servant of Caesar, and Valeria Sweetie, Valeria Glycia, or Claudia Prepusa, a kinswoman and benefactress. And now we get Phrygian. Does anyone want to try and read the Phrygian? Now, thank goodness that we can read so well the Greek letters, can't we? So we can know what this language sounded like, sound out the words. It's a great benefit for us. Another language that I'll be doing a workshop on later, Carian. They use the Greek letters, but they've reassigned all of the sound values. So in Carian, what looks like a sigma is an A. Looks like a lambda is an N, mid sound. But that's not the case with Phrygian. So let's just be grateful for that. So who wants to read out the Phrygian?
Iosni semun mani kakun ada daket yet antikmenos
All right. Iosni semon kumani kakun adaket tiatikmenos itu. Yes, that is a word. Tiatikmenos there, quite a crazy one. All right. Now, we're going to quickly, what you're going to see in this document as we work through the material is there's extensive philological commentary on every word. Okay? Now, the reason why I've done this document like this is because this is going to get us at really the science, philological science behind how we can crack Phrygian. We can look at these words and we can really figure out, okay, this is what's going on with this language. And this is where we're going to meet Proto-Indo-European again and again and again. Now, is everyone comfortable if we go just a few minutes over time, instead of 10:30, maybe 10:35, something like that, just so we can quickly get through this document before we power through the rest? People in the room are happy? I'm going to give people online a couple of seconds to voice their objections. I understand that it's very important to stay caffeinated and hydrated, but if we can hold off a few more minutes. Yep, chat. Take as long as you like. Wonderful. Okay, that's a dangerous thing to say to me, Aaron. Okay, now, first of all, like I said, most of the Phrygian curses, well, they're curses, they're imprecations actually. So an imprecation is don't do this or else may this thing happen to you. It's actually a curse. It's not saying this thing will definitely happen to you. It's a curse. It's invoking a higher power to say, may this bad fate befall you. Now, the term that we use to refer to these two types of clauses is a protarsis and an apodosis. It's the same as in conditions. And if something will happen, then something will happen. The if is the protarsis. The don't do this is the protarsis. The apodosis is the or else this will happen. So in this Phrygian text, we can divide it in likewise into a protarsis and an apodosis of the imprecation. The protarsis is ios nisemun numani kakuna daket. Now, ios, this is our first word. And we're going to see that this starts quite a few of the protarses for this. Levi, what word is ios in Greek?
Hos.
Hos. So here we have a clear reflex of a Greek word. Hos, he, ho, which is the relative pronoun. So in Phrygian, this word is in the masculine singular, nominative, ios. And so what we have here is a derivative from the relative adjective, Proto-Indo-European. Proto-Indo-European relative adjective had the stem. So the H1IO that you can see written there. Now this is where we're going to meet. This is where we're going to meet Indo-European phonetics, and I'm not going to dive into that to too much detail now, but we're going to slowly learn it as we go. What you need to know is that that H1 there is, for all intents and purposes, a T sound. And that's not a controversial thing to say anymore. These are reconstructed consonants in Proto-Indo-European, and I'll talk more about them later. So this,
or is it laryngeal?
Laryngeals, yeah. So these are a reconstructed sequence of consonants in Indo-European, laryngeals, which we represent with H1, H2, and H3. I'll go into more detail about that later, but for our purposes, we should treat this stem as hyo. So in Proto-Indo-European, the way that you made a relative adjective was you used the stem hyo, and this is what's come down to Greek as hos, he, ho. Greek relative pronoun. I would write that on the screen for your benefit, but unfortunately, I'm using Macquarie's computer system here, which doesn't have a Greek keyboard installed. But hang on, I've got it there in my notes for your benefit. There you go. You see, good thing I took such detailed notes. All right. Now, the next word we have hyos ni. Now, ni is an indefinite enclitic particle. Now, this is just a word that we see used in Phrygian a lot. Ni. It's a wonderful word, ni. Monty Python reference there for you. It seems to function a lot like the Greek an, the modal particle. But basically, it's a particle that you seem to be able to add to a word to make it have an indefinite or contingent sense. So what we have here is yosni or yosni, okay? And this means who, maybe, literally whoever. This is addressing the potential victim of the imprecation. Semun knumani. All right, so semun, this is a dative singular form, and this is where a cursory knowledge of Greek will really help you with our discussion today, because for the large part, the grammatical features of Phrygian can be explained by mapping them onto equivalent forms in Greek. So we have a similar sequence of cases in Phrygian. We have identified a dative in the Phrygian language, and here this is the dative form of one of their demonstrative pronouns. So semun here is this thing. Now, it doesn't have what you would expect dative to have as the ending. You're looking for an iota or something. Don't let that bother you. We're going to see plenty of iotas pop up where we expect datives later on. But this is reliably a dative of the demonstrative pronoun, semun. So this thing, so whoever, yosni, semun, this thing. So what is a demonstrative qualifying? That's the next word. Right? The syntax is quite easy for us to work with here. Knumani. Now, Maria, what sound does knumani end in? It's in an E, which for those of you familiar with Greek and to a certain extent Latin, might encourage you to think this is a dative form, and indeed, this is a dative form we have in Phrygian. Knumani, this is the dative singular of the neuter noun knuman, which means tomb. Actually, it seems to mean literally something like dug thing. It seems to come from the same verbal root as the Greek verb knuor, which means to scratch something or to dig something. You can see there another quite close surface similarity between Phrygian and Greek. Who yosni, whoever, semun knumani, this tomb, kakun. This is wonderful. Does anyone in the room want to have a guess what kakun might mean? Yeah, exactly. So this is a substantive use of a Phrygian adjective, meaning bad or evil. What that means is it's an adjective that means bad that's been used as a noun meaning bad thing, wicked act or something like that. Now, this could either be a loan word from the Greek word kakos, bad or wicked, or a Phrygian word, same etymology. So what that is not that the Phrygians got the word from Greek, it's that both Greeks and Phrygians got it from the same earlier stage of the language. We don't actually know because we don't know what the etymology of kakos is. And because of the reduplication in it, kaka, it might just be what we call a lalvut, a word that just sounds like what it is. So it could be that from a very early stage, Proto-Phrygio Greek speakers were just describing something they don't like as kaka, and this became their word for bad or wicked. There isn't a true etymology to it. This is impossible to verify. Nonetheless, this is our accusative singular noun, and it means wicked or bad act or harm. Yes?
What's the reconstructed, they reconstructed the letters in the middle, and it's given it the same ending as the dative singular ending. Just curious.
In the body of the text.
Yeah,
Oh, yes. Yes.
reconstructed, but
Now that is a, so what,
picked up the accusative
yes.
ending as
So Maria's pointing out that the endings semun and kakun seem to match, but we know from the broader study of Phrygian that semun is a dative form. Yeah. So the reason why we know that is because we always get it referring to datives that are morphologically unambiguous. They're
sure about the kakun, which has been reconstructed.
The kakun is definite, yes.
For instance, in text 2, there's kakun.
Yeah, okay. Assuming it's probably no.
Yeah, but this is a good point Maria is making, which is that like how can we verify this? And it's when we read, when we do this is called combinatorial studies, which is a large part of what we'll be doing today, actually. Now let's go to the next word, adarket. I love this. This is our verb. We've met our first Phrygian verb, adarket. This is a present indicative verb. Okay. Now, our knowledge of the Phrygian system of tenses and moods it's one of the features of the Phrygian language we know the least about yet. So whenever I say this is a present indicative, this is an aorist, whatever, please take that with a pinch of salt, as indeed all philologists who work on Phrygian verbs would encourage you to do. This is just the best that we can guess from what we know of Phrygian right now, although a present indicative sense does seem to fit the context here. Now, as I keep using these grammatical terms, everyone, for anyone in the online who doesn't have a background in Greek or Latin or sufficient background to understand these terms, feel free to drop in a question. I'm always happy to clarify this terminology. All right, so now it means to do to or to put to, and this is actually from the Proto-Indo-European root, deher. So you can see it there in the apparatus from the PIE. By the way, let's just agree to call Proto-Indo-European pi from now on, because I'm going to say it so many times that it'll save time. So it derives from the pi stem deher, and do or put. And this is actually the origin of the the theta eta in the Greek verb tithemi. Does anyone know what tithemi means in Greek?
To put or place.
To put or place, exactly. So this is what we call a cognate. All right, this is the same stem with a similar meaning, deriving from the same Proto-Indo-European form. This is the Phrygian equivalent. Now notice here that we don't have da yet, we don't have da et or anything like that. We have adarket for this third person singular form. That's because here we have a preverb added, ad, which is actually a preverb we're going to see again and again. So this is actually kind of equivalent to a Greek form like prostithemi, for example. Also notice that we have an infix here before the ending. The ending is et, right? That final dental, t. What language does that remind you of in the third person singular? Latin. Now that is the old Indo-European form. The third singular ended in the active in a dental stop, but in Greek, all of those dental stops dropped away. But in Latin, they preserved, and they did in Phrygian too. So, for example, what would be a Latin verb of putting in the third person singular? My Latin is failing me now. Yakio can mean put.
Yeah.
Actually, or put. Well, the third person's.
I don't remember if it's second or third conjugation. Pones, it would be like what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, ponere.
Third conjugation.
Yeah. So we would have in Latin, we would have a form something like a yacet. Yacet or yacet?
Yeah.
I'm a Greekist.
Yeah.
Okay, was second conjugation, so it'd be
Yeah.
like that.
So anyway, the Latin forms, the rustiness of my Latin is betraying me here. That's why I usually invoke Greek for my evidence. But we do see a specifically Greek form here in this verb form, adaket. Notice here we have an infix, a kappa infix added after the stem and before the ending. Now, those of you who have a lot of Greek will probably recognize with terror that kappa infix. You're a bit early on in your Alex #1 in your journey with Greek, but soon you will meet Greek verbs with kappa infixes, and you're going to, if you're like me, love them, but if you're like most people, hate them. So the sense we have here is Yosni semun knumani kakuna daket. Yosni, whoever, semun knumani, this too, kakun, a wicked act or harm, adaket, puts to or places harm to this monument. And then we have the apodosis. Tietitikmenos itu. I think tietitikmenos has to be another word of the day too. Isn't that a wonderful word? Basically 3 words, and this is what's going to happen to them. And what I'll do is I'll do the first word last because it's the most interesting one. Itu, although this is fascinating, this is a imperative, active, third person singular of the Greek, of a verb meaning be or become. Now, it's very tempting to connect it to the Greek verb eimi, meaning be, which comes from the stem es, es, or hes in Proto-Indo-European. It's actually not the case. This comes from the Proto-Indo-European root hey, and it has the sense come or go. And in quite a few languages that take this root, verbal derivations from this root, there's a semantic change, and come or go becomes become, and it becomes a copulative verb. And this has become the case in Phrygian. Phrygian copula, the Phrygian verb of being, doesn't come from eimi sum, as the LSJ would put it, but it comes from eimi ibo, quite interestingly. Don't treat this as a verb of coming or going. In Phrygian, this means be or become. Imperative active third person singular, itu, notice the ending to there is equivalent to the Greek imperative active third person singular, to, with tau omega. So if you want to say in Greek, let them be, let him be, you would say estor. If you want to say that in Phrygian, you say itu. Now, here we have a perfect passive participle, titetikmenos, nominative, singular, masculine, and it's agreeing with the yos, all right? This is something we're going to see again and again in these forms. So the yos, he, or whoever, better to translate it, the nominative masculine singular, is then suffering the act of the verb in the apodosis. If you are titetikmenos, you are judged. Now, it's hard to see, but the root of judging there is tik, okay? And this is actually cognate with the Greek verb deik. They both come from Proto-Indo-European, deik. We get Latin dico, get it, from there as well as nouns derived from that stem, like digit, finger, pointing thing, yeah. Dicor being in Latin a verb that has many senses, but not so much judge, rather communicate, show, point, lead, that sort of thing. Notice that we have a reduplicated stem, just like in Greek. Hard to see because of the T, that's just a particle that floats around in Phrygian. That's actually not a fundamental part of the verbal stem itself. If we take away the T, we have the form tetik. So that's extremely similar to what you would see in a Greek passive participle. We even have the same infix, meno, in Phrygian and Greek, which both come from a Proto-Indo-European middle participle, mchno. All right, so let him be judged. First word, yeah. Now this one is really crazy. this is Zeus, the dative. All right, so the word Zeus comes from the Proto-Indo-European root, probably one of the most famous roots we can reconstruct. Jau meant daylight. Now, Jau, in cases other than the nominative in Indo-European, that stem ablauded to diu. So for example, in Greek, that's why we have the dative form diwi. So in Phrygian, inherited voiced consonants, so that's things like d, well, they devoiced to t. So we get an old Phrygian dative form, for example, tie, or what would be diwi in Greek. Now, the pronunciation of the word final iota has dropped in New Phrygian. So we get iotas starting to drop out of the language. All right, so we've read our first Phrygian text. Now I think it's time to have a break. So just to recap, Phrygian here, we have Yos nisemun knumani kakunadaket. Whoever does places harm upon this tomb, tie titetik menos itu. Let them be judged by Zeus. All right. Hearing our first Phrygian of the day. All right, thank you, Claire. Claire's ducking out for a while, but she'll join us again later. And I think it's what we'll do is, how does everyone feel about a 15-20 minute break for coffee? I'll be back here at 11, ready to go, and we'll see how many people are back in the room and who's there. All right, thank you, everyone.